The settlers brought their language and customs with them to New Mexico. They spoke Spanish, kept their Catholic faith, and enjoyed music and dances from Spain and Mexico. They raised animals that were common in Spain, such as horses, mules, donkeys, oxen, sheep, and chickens. They grew crops that were familiar to them, such as wheat, onions, carrots, apples, and apricots. To water their fields, they built special ditches called acequias that are like the ones used in Spain. But they also learned from their Indian neighbors to use native foods like corn, squash, and pine nuts, and to make clothing such as moccasins. Pueblo Indians had lived in New Mexico for centuries before the settlers arrived. Over the years, the Indians and the settlers slowly learned to live as neighbors. By the time Josefina was a girl, the settlers and Pueblo Indians often fought together against enemy tribes such as the Comanche, Apache, Navajo, and Ute. These Indians sometimes traveled to northern New Mexico to raid homes and farms. New Mexican settlers never forgot the danger of Indian attacks, and women and children were not allowed to go far from home. Okay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Keeps going with the kind of background information. There's about 5 pages of it. There's a little glossary to help you with your Spanish pronunciation, so don't forego this book because of that reason. And then, well, let me read the last selection that I have from you. This is about Josefina's grandfather and his caravan. Abuelito was their mama's father. He was a trader, and once each year he organized a huge caravan. The caravan was made up of many carts pulled by oxen and many mules carrying packs. The carts and the mules were loaded with wool, hides, and blankets in New Mexico. Then the caravan traveled more than 1,000 miles south to Mexico City. The trail the caravans used was called the Camino Real. When Abuelito got to Mexico City, he traded the goods he'd bought from New Mexico for things from all over the world. He traded for silk and cotton goods and lace, for iron tools, paper, ink, books, fine dishes, coffee, and sugar. Then the caravan would load up and start the long trip back to New Mexico. Abuelito had been gone for more than 6 months. Josefina and her sisters were excited because they expected Abuelito's caravan to return any day now. Their rancho was always the caravan's last stop before the town of Santa Fe, where Abuelito lived. So, and there's about 3 more books that follow in this strand after this one of Josefina's life. She's about 10 in the book, I would say. Her sisters are a little bit older. And I haven't read the other strands of that kind of series. I've just read the Josefina one. But I really like those books because they are well-researched historical fiction. The stories are age-appropriate for upper elementary to middle school. The reading levels are considerably lower, so they're good books for reluctant readers in middle school or for students who maybe English isn't their native language and their English skills might be a little behind their age level. I think that's about what I have to say about that one. It's interesting because it goes back to kind of colonial times and tells that from the perspective of Southwest, which is also a Mexican-American perspective in the case of that book. And while it tries to pick kind of a typical family and show how their daily life works, it also does include some kind of different experiences so students don't get the impression that everyone who was alive in that place at that time had the same life. So that's American Girl and Josefina. This book, Esperanza Rising, are any of you guys familiar with this book? This is one of my all-time favorites. On a personal level, it's the first book that I ever read entirely in Spanish for the first time instead of pre-reading it in English. But again, this book technically is at an upper elementary level. I think it's about a 5th grade level, 5th to 6th grade reading level. But I recommend it to my students all the way up to 8th grade, and they all really like it. It's not. It's a pretty mature storyline, so it would be good for 5th graders, 6th graders, maybe even 4th graders if they're high readers. There's nothing inappropriate in it, but it's engaging enough to catch their interest. And it's about a girl whose name is Esperanza. She lives in Mexico, and her father owns a large farm, so they're a pretty wealthy family. It's her mom, her grandma who live in the household, and then they have a lot of people who work for the family, both in the fields and in the house. So I'm going to give you a little cross-section of this whole story because it hits on so many different aspects of history and immigration. It's set in 1930 is when it's set, so right during the time of the Depression. And it starts off in Aguascalientes, Mexico. These are all my library books, so I didn't pencil mark exactly where I was going to start, so I have to look on every page and that's why I'm having a little confusion with where I'm supposed to stop on this too. Okay, Las Uvas, grapes, 6 years later. The August sun promised a dry afternoon in Aguascalientes, Mexico. Everyone who lived and worked on El Rancho de las Rosas was gathered at the edge of the field. Esperanza's family, the house servants in their long white aprons, the vaqueros already sitting on their horses ready to ride out to the cattle, and 50 or 60 campesinos, straw hats in their hands, holding their own knives ready. They were covered top to bottom in long-sleeve shirts, baggy pants tied at the ankles with string, and bandanas wrapped around their foreheads and necks to protect them from the sun, dust, and spiders. Esperanza, on the other hand, wore a light silk dress that stopped above her summer boots, and no hat. On top of her head, a wide satin ribbon was tied in a big bow, the tails trailing in her long black hair. The clusters were heavy on the vine and ready to deliver. Esperanza's parents, Ramona and Sixto Ortega, stood nearby. Mama, tall and elegant, her hair in the usual braided wreath that crowned her head, and Papa, barely taller than Mama, his graying mustache twisted up at the sides. He swept his hand toward the grapevines, signaling Esperanza. When she walked toward the arbors and glanced back at her parents, they both smiled and nodded, encouraging her forward. When she reached the vines, she separated the leaves and carefully grasped a thick stem. She put the knife to it, and with a quick swipe, the heavy cluster of grapes dropped into her waiting hands. Esperanza walked back to Papa and handed him the fruit. Papa kissed it and held it up for all to see. La cosecha, said Papa. Harvest. So Esperanza has a pretty good life. She's pretty happy with her life. Everything is great in her world. And then, of course, because it's a book, and it wouldn't be a very good book if her life was just happy and calm, everything kind of hits the fan. And let me find the part where I'm going to start reading. Okay, and first of all, Esperanza's father dies, and then the ranch burns down. So her family is really kind of destitute at this point. And one of Esperanza's father's brothers proposes to her mother. He wants to take over the farm and says, you know, Esperanza's mother should marry him, and she doesn't want to. He's kind of a disreputable character. They all crowded into Hortensia and Alfonso's tiny bedroom, where Abuelita was resting, her swollen ankle propped on pillows. And Hortensia and Alfonso is the mother and father to another family who Esperanza has grown up with them because they work in her house. Esperanza sat on Abuelita's bed while Mama and the others stood. Alfonso, what are my options? Said Mama. If you don't intend to marry him, Senora, you cannot stay here. He would burn down the servants' quarters next. There will be no income because there are no grapes. You would have to depend on the charity of others, and they would be afraid to help you. You could move to some other part of Mexico, but in poverty. Luis's influence is far-reaching. The room was quiet. Mama looked out the window and tapped her fingers on the wooden sill. Hortensia went to Mama's side and touched her arm. You should know that we have decided to go to the United States. Alfonso's brother has been writing to us about the big farm in California where he works now. He can arrange jobs and a cabin for us too. We're sending the letter tomorrow. So, in that fashion, Esperanza's mom makes the decision to move herself and her daughter north to California. However, Esperanza's in for